We're just about ready to join our data files together. If we take a look at our two data frames, we have our minimum wage data and we have our GDP data. However, if we take a look at our GDP data, our value column is not yet in a number format. We can confirm this to ourselves by doing print gdpmelt.dtypes. We have object for our value column. So we need to convert our GDP values to numbers, don't we? Take a moment and try converting all of the GDP values into numbers. This is the same kind of cleaning code that we used in previous weeks. We extracted our GDP column, replaced the commas with empty string, convert the column to numbers, and then put our cleaned column back into our data frame. Now we're ready to join our two data frames. At least we're almost ready. So now that our data frames have equal granularity, we're almost ready to join them. But in order to join them, we need to first index our data frames. So every data frame has something called an index, and the index provides row labels or names for each row in your data frame. By default, pandas will give each row a number starting at 0. And our index columns need to have the same names in both of our data frames in order for the join to be successful. Your index columns need to be equal to whatever your overlapping granularity is. In our case, we will call our index columns date and jurisdiction in both data frames. And indexes, as I mentioned, they're the unique identifier or the name for each row. And indexes can be made up of one or more columns. When Pandas joins rows together in two data frames, it will match rows which have the same index in both data frames. First thing we'll do is come into Python, and we're going to make sure that our columns have the correct names before we go any further. Before you do any of your joins, it is good practice to make sure that your columns have the final names that you want in your final data frame. So in GDP melt, I'm going to set my columns equal to year, jurisdiction, and GDP. For minimum wage, I'm going to set my columns to year, jurisdiction, and min wage. So if I look at GDP melt, I have year, jurisdiction, GDP. If I look at minimum wage, I have year, jurisdiction, minimum wage. To index our data frames, we use the setIndex function and specify the names of the columns that will be part of our new index. So let's do that. So we'll set, after our rename of columns, we'll say GDP melt equals GDP melt.set_index. And then in square brackets, we say that our index is made up of year and jurisdiction. And we will do the same thing for minimum wage. And if I run this, you'll now see the minimum wage data frame. We have year and jurisdiction. Notice how the font is a little bit different. This is your clue that you've got that these two columns are part of your index. And now we have the minimum wage column. And same thing with GDP melt. Year and jurisdiction and our GDP. With all of that done, with our data cleaned, with our indexes set, with our columns renamed, we are now ready for the main event, joining data frames. As luck would have it, Pandas has a join function built in called join. So we're going to join the minimum wage data to our GDP melt data frame. And we'll use the GDP melt data frame as our left-hand data frame and the minimum wage data as our right-hand data frame. How do we join these files together? It's one line. we set our joined data frame variable equal to our left-hand table dot join, and then we specify in brackets our right-hand table. Let's try this. I will create a variable called joined, and I will do gdpmelt.join min wage. With that, I have a new variable, joined, with year, jurisdiction, GDP, and minimum wage. Now, I am seeing NANs for minimum wage. Let's scroll down and take a look at that. 2009 Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a pair for GDP and minimum wage. 2010 Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a pair for GDP and minimum wage. But all of a sudden, we have NAN. Interesting. So the join worked, but it looks like we may have some extra work to do.